morning I gave my soul to the light began like any other in the ruins of Lordaeron. I had been a baker for 9 years, 2 months, and 14 days since the plague passed through our village. The count mattered because every survivor kept track, marking time between the death of our old world and whatever would come next. 9 years of kneading bread from grain that grew in tainted soil, of serving customers who whispered prayers before each meal, wondering if this bite would be their last. The morning everything changed, I woke to the sound of horses and the gleam of scarlet banners on the horizon. The bakery stood at the crossroads of what had once been the prosperous village of Millhaven, 3 days' ride south of the capital. Before the plague, merchants would stop here on their way to Lordaeron city, buying fresh bread and sweet pastries for the journey. Children would press their faces against the shop windows, watching me shape dough into twisted loaves and crescent rolls. The ovens burned bright every morning, filling the air with the warm scent of yeast and flour that meant home and safety and the promise of another peaceful day. Now the windows were boarded with rough planks salvaged from abandoned houses. The merchant roads had become paths for refugees and scavengers when they were used at all. Most travelers avoided our region entirely, knowing that the very air might carry death. The village that had once housed 300 souls now sheltered perhaps 40 survivors, scattered among buildings that showed the telltale stains of hasty abandonment and darker marks that no one discussed. My ovens still burned each morning, but the fires were smaller now, conserving fuel that grew more precious each month. The bread I baked was dense and coarse, made from whatever grain could be found in the surrounding farmlands. Some fields still produced crops, though the yields were unpredictable and the quality questionable. We had learned to test everything carefully, watching for signs of corruption that might indicate plague contamination. A single infected bushel could doom an entire community. The survivors who remained were bound together by necessity rather than choice. We had become a family of circumstance, sharing resources and responsibilities because individual survival was impossible. Miller Gareth maintained the grain stores with obsessive care, tracking every sack and counting every kernel. Blacksmith Thorne kept our tools functional despite the shortage of proper materials. Seamstress Marta mended clothing until the fabric could hold no more patches, then found ways to weave new garments from salvaged threads. Every morning brought the same routine of careful survival. Check the grain for signs of rot or infestation. Test the water from the well that served our small community. Examine the bread dough for unusual colors or odors that might indicate contamination. Light the ovens with measured amounts of precious fuel. Bake enough bread to feed our people while conserving resources for tomorrow's needs. The work had become meditation, each familiar step a barrier against the chaos that surrounded our small island of order. The plague had taken my wife and daughter during the first wave of infection. Elena had been helping me in the bakery when the sickness reached our village, working beside me as she had for 12 years of marriage. Little Sarah had been only 7 years old, still young enough to believe that her father could protect her from anything that threatened their home. They died within hours of each other, leaving me alone with ovens that suddenly seemed too large, and rooms that echoed with memories of laughter. I had considered following them into death during those first terrible weeks. The plague offered many opportunities for joining lost loved ones, and suicide required no special preparations or rare materials. But something had prevented me from taking that final step, some stubborn refusal to surrender that I could not name or understand. Perhaps it was duty to the other survivors who depended on fresh bread each morning. Perhaps it was simple cowardice disguised as noble purpose. The reason mattered less than the result, which was continued existence in a world that no longer made sense. The undead were a constant presence in our daily lives, though we had learned to coexist with them through careful avoidance and defensive preparation. Shambling corpses would wander through the village occasionally, drawn by sounds or movement that caught their attention. Most were harmless if left undisturbed, former villagers who retained enough memory of home to return here even after death. We had developed procedures for dealing with them, methods that minimized risk while showing respect for what they had once been. The more dangerous undead came from outside our community, plague victims from distant settlements who retained enough intelligence to hunt actively for living prey. These creatures required different responses, usually involving the entire village in coordinated defensive actions. We had converted the old temple into a fortified refuge where everyone could gather when serious threats appeared. The building's stone walls and narrow windows made it defensible, and its sacred history provided psychological comfort during sieges that might last for days. Stories from beyond our village painted pictures of devastation that made our small struggles seem manageable by comparison. Refugees brought tales of entire cities consumed by undeath, of armies of corpses marching under banners they no longer understood. They spoke of heroes who had fallen fighting the plague, paladins whose faith had proven insufficient against the tide of necromantic corruption. The great kingdom of Lordaeron, which had stood for centuries as a beacon of human civilization, had crumbled in months. Prince Arthas Menethil had become the symbol of our collective nightmare, the crown prince who had brought doom to his own people in the name of salvation. Tales of his fall from paladin to death knight circulated among survivors like dark prayers, stories told to remind us how completely the world had changed. If someone so pure and noble could become an agent of destruction, what hope remained for ordinary people trying to preserve small fragments of normal life? The Knights of the Silver Hand had been our greatest source of hope during the dark times. Stories of Uther the Lightbringer and his fellow paladins provided comfort when reality became too harsh to bear directly. Children who had never seen a paladin could recite tales of their heroic deeds, battles against orcish invaders and demonic corruption. The knights represented everything noble and protective about human civilization, warriors who fought not for glory or wealth, but to shield the innocent from harm. But the knights were gone now, killed or corrupted, or simply missing when their people needed them most. Uther himself had fallen to his former student's cursed blade. Other founding members had died fighting impossible odds or disappeared into regions too dangerous for news to emerge. The order that had once seemed eternal and unbreakable had proven as mortal as everything else in our collapsing world. Sleep came fitfully during these years, interrupted by sounds that might indicate approaching danger or simply the settling of damaged buildings around us. Dreams brought memories of better times, mixed with fears about what each new day might bring. Sometimes I would wake believing that Elena and Sarah were still alive, that the plague had been nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. The moment of remembering truth was always the hardest part of each day, worse than the actual work of survival that followed. Food distribution required careful planning and constant adjustment based on available supplies. We had established rationing systems that ensured everyone received adequate nutrition while preserving resources for lean periods. The bread I baked was supplemented by vegetables from small gardens maintained within the village perimeter, protein from chickens and goats that we guarded carefully against both human and undead threats, and preserved foods that we hoarded against the possibility of extended siege. Trade with other survivor communities had become our primary source of materials that we could not produce locally. Merchant caravans still traveled the safer roads, carrying goods between settlements that maintained some semblance of normal commerce. These traders brought news from the outside world along with their merchandise, stories that helped us understand how our small struggles connected to larger patterns of collapse and recovery. The coins that had once defined economic relationships had become less important than practical skills and useful materials. A skilled healer was worth more than gold in communities where injury or illness could mean death. Someone who could repair weapons or preserve food commanded respect that no amount of wealth could purchase. The social hierarchies that had defined village life before the plague had been replaced by pragmatic arrangements based on survival value. Weather patterns had changed since the plague, or perhaps we simply noticed them more carefully now that our lives depended on agricultural success. Winters seemed longer and harsher, testing our fuel supplies and forcing us to crowd together in heated spaces that bred tension alongside warmth. Summers brought different challenges, as increased temperatures could spoil food more quickly, while drought conditions threatened our water sources. The temple bells that had once marked the hours throughout each day now rang only for emergencies or special occasions. Time had become fluid in our reduced circumstances, measured by the rhythms of survival rather than arbitrary divisions imposed by clocks and calendars. Morning meant lighting the ovens and beginning the day's work. Noon brought the communal meal where we shared whatever food was available. Evening meant securing the village and preparing for another night of vigilant rest. Letters from distant relatives had stopped arriving months ago, leaving us isolated from whatever remained of the larger world beyond our immediate region. We had no way of knowing if other parts of the kingdom had recovered more successfully, or if our small community represented one of the last pockets of human civilization. The uncertainty was harder to bear than definitive knowledge of universal devastation would have been. Children born after the plague had never known the world as it had existed before, accepting our reduced circumstances as normal rather than tragic. They played games that involved hiding from imaginary undead and practiced skills that would help them survive in a hostile environment. Their adaptability was both inspiring and heartbreaking, proof of humanity's resilience and evidence of how much we had lost. This was the life I had built from the ashes of everything I had once known, a routine of careful survival that provided meaning through necessity, if not through joy. Each day brought the same challenges and the same small victories, creating a rhythm that made existence bearable even when it could not make it pleasant. The world beyond our village remained dangerous and unknown, but our small corner of it had achieved a kind of fragile stability that seemed worth preserving. The morning that would change everything began like any other, with the familiar ritual of testing grain and lighting ovens. But something was different about the quality of light filtering through the boarded windows, and sounds from the road suggested travelers approaching our village. As I worked the bread dough with practiced motions, I found myself listening more carefully than usual to the voices that grew clearer with each passing moment. The riders appeared at midday when the sun cast sharp shadows between the ruined buildings that lined our village's main road. I was pulling the second batch of bread from the ovens when Miller Gareth burst through the bakery door, his face flushed with excitement and something that might have been hope. "Strangers on the road," he announced breathlessly. Armed and organized, wearing colors I had not seen since before the plague swept through our lands. Through the gaps in my boarded windows, I watched 12 mounted figures approach with military precision that spoke of training and discipline rather than the desperate improvisation that characterized most travelers in our region. Their horses were well fed and properly equipped, suggesting access to resources that had become legendary rather than real. But it was their appearance that drew attention from every surviving villager who dared to observe from concealed positions. Scarlet tabards blazed like flames against the grey landscape of our diminished world. The color was so vivid and pure that it seemed impossible, a declaration of faith and purpose that refused to acknowledge the reality of decay surrounding us. Silver threading caught the sunlight with each movement, creating patterns that suggested wealth and care lavished on these uniforms. Even their weapons gleamed with maintenance that spoke of pride in appearance as well as function. The leader rode slightly ahead of his companions, a man whose bearing suggested authority earned through experience rather than inherited privilege. His face was weathered by exposure to wind and sun, marked by small scars that told stories of combat survived and lessons learned. When he spoke, his voice carried the trained cadence of someone accustomed to addressing groups and expecting immediate attention. "Citizens of Millhaven," he called out, his words echoing against the damaged buildings that surrounded our small gathering. "I am Commander Marwyn Redpath of the Scarlet Crusade, servant of the light and defender of humanity's righteous cause. We come not as conquerors, but as brothers, seeking those who would join us in the sacred mission of reclaiming our homeland from the forces of darkness that have consumed it." The villagers emerged slowly from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic presence of organized authority. We had grown accustomed to visitors who begged for food or shelter, refugees who brought only tales of disaster and pleas for assistance we could barely provide ourselves. These strangers offered something different, something that felt like possibility rather than burden. Commander Redpath dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and purposeful. His companions remained mounted but alert, their positions suggesting defensive preparation rather than aggressive intent. They were professionals conducting a recruitment operation with practiced efficiency, following procedures developed through repetition across numerous similar communities. "Gather close, friends," the commander continued, his tone shifting to something more intimate and personal. "Let me speak to you of hope in these dark times, of purpose that transcends mere survival. You have endured much since the fall of Lord Aeron, holding fast to life when death seemed the easier choice. Your courage in the face of such trials proves that the light still burns within you, waiting to be kindled into righteous flame." The words struck something deep within my chest, a resonance that I had not felt since the early days after Elena and Sarah's death, when grief threatened to consume everything rational. Here was someone speaking of meaning beyond the daily routine of measured survival, offering connection to something larger than the careful preservation of bread ovens and grain stores. "You know the names that once brought comfort to the people of this kingdom," Redpath continued, his gaze sweeping across our small crowd with practiced assessment. "Uther the Lightbringer, whose hammer shattered the enemies of humanity. Turalion the Bold, whose faith never wavered in the face of demonic corruption. Tyrion Fordring, whose deeds became legend even among his enemies. These champions of the light established the Knights of the Silver Hand as humanity's shield against darkness. The familiar names carried weight that transcended their historical significance, representing everything noble and protective that had been lost when our world collapsed. Children who had learned to walk among ruins still dreamed of paladins whose righteousness could turn back any evil. Adults who had watched civilization crumble still whispered prayers that invoked their protection. But the Silver Hand was broken by treachery and overwhelmed by forces too vast for mortal comprehension, the commander acknowledged with carefully measured sorrow. The knights fell one by one, their light extinguished by enemies who showed no mercy to the righteous. Yet their vision endures, passed down to those who would continue their sacred work through new means and renewed dedication. One of his companions, a woman whose scarred hands suggested extensive combat experience, stepped forward to address us directly. "I am Captain Darnell," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of proven competence. "I served under Uther himself during the final battles against the Scourge, fighting beside paladins whose faith could heal the wounded and smite the wicked. When the Order fell, I thought that hope had died with it. But the Scarlet Crusade has shown me that the light's work continues through those who possess the courage to take up arms in its service." The testimonial carried conviction that could not be manufactured, the weight of personal experience transformed into recruitment tool. Here was someone who had stood beside legends, who could speak with first-hand knowledge about the heroes whose stories had sustained us through the darkest times. Her presence validated everything the commander had said about continuing their legacy. The plague that consumed our kingdom was not merely disease, Redpath explained, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of practiced oratory. It was corruption given physical form, evil that spreads through contact and contamination. Those who succumbed became carriers of darkness, spreading taint wherever their shambling forms wandered. But corruption takes many forms, and some of the infected retain cunning that makes them far more dangerous than mindless corpses. He gestured toward the horizon where smoke columns rose from distant settlements, evidence of conflicts that we could only imagine from our isolated position. The Forsaken who claim independence from the Lich King's control are perhaps the greatest threat of all, he continued. They possess the intelligence to plan and organize while retaining the supernatural resilience of undeath. They seek to spread their curse to the living, creating more of their kind through plague and necromancy that they call liberation. The words painted pictures of horror that exceeded even our direct experience with shambling corpses and plague-touched livestock. The idea of intelligent undead who could think and plan added new dimensions to fears that had already made sleep difficult. But the commander offered more than warnings about distant threats. The Scarlet Crusade stands as humanity's final bastion against these forces of corruption, he declared with rising intensity. We are the inheritors of the Silverhand's mission, dedicated to cleansing our homeland through holy fire and righteous steel. Our monasteries train warriors whose faith can burn away taint. Our inquisitors root out corruption before it can spread. Our armies carry the light's blessing into battle against enemies that would see all humanity consumed. Captain Darnell unfolded a banner that had been secured to her saddle, revealing embroidered images that illustrated the Crusade's mission in vivid detail. Paladins wielding blessed weapons against hordes of undead. Priests channeling divine magic to heal wounded civilians. Soldiers in scarlet armor standing triumphant over fallen enemies whose forms suggested corruption beyond natural decay. Your skills in this village demonstrate exactly the qualities we seek in new recruits, Redpath continued, his attention focusing on specific individuals whose capabilities he had apparently assessed during his earlier observations. Blacksmith Thorn, your knowledge of metalworking is essential for maintaining weapons and armor in the field. Miller Gareth, your experience with grain storage and food preservation makes you invaluable for supply operations. Baker Keldrick, your understanding of nutrition and resource management would serve our cause well in quartermaster duties. The personal attention was intoxicating after years of anonymity, broken only by the mechanical interactions necessary for community survival. Someone had noticed our individual contributions and deemed them worthy of larger purpose. The recognition carried weight that transcended practical considerations, offering validation that our efforts had meaning beyond mere persistence. We offer training that will transform dedicated civilians into holy warriors capable of standing against any evil, Captain Darnell explained. Our instructors are veterans of campaigns across multiple theaters of operation, battle-tested soldiers who understand both the theory and practice of righteous warfare. You will learn to wield weapons blessed by priests whose faith can channel divine power directly into steel and iron. The promise of transformation resonated with desires I had not acknowledged even to myself. Dreams of becoming something more significant than a survivor, measuring flour and counting days. The possibility of trading careful preservation for active purpose, of exchanging defensive preparation for offensive capability, offered escape from the suffocating routine of managed decline. But the Crusade offers more than military training, Redpath continued, his voice dropping to more intimate tones that suggested personal connection rather than public address. We provide community based on shared dedication to humanity's survival, brothers and sisters united by common cause, supporting each other through trials that would break isolated individuals. Purpose that extends beyond personal preservation to the sacred mission of reclaiming our homeland for the living. Young Marta, the seamstress whose skills had kept our clothing functional despite shortages of proper materials, stepped forward with visible emotion. "My husband died fighting the undead when they first reached our village," she said, her voice carrying pain that had never fully healed. "Every day I mend clothes for people who might not live to wear them tomorrow. If there's truly a way to fight back, to make their deaths mean something, then I want to be part of it." Her declarations seemed to release similar sentiments that had been building within others throughout the recruitment presentation. Miller Gareth nodded with growing conviction, his practical mind apparently calculating the probability of long-term survival through passive resistance versus active participation in organized resistance. Blacksmith Thorne examined the Crusaders' weapons and equipment with professional appreciation for quality that exceeded anything he had seen in recent years. The decision process felt strangely familiar, resembling the calculations I had made years earlier when choosing to continue living rather than joining Elena and Sarah in death. The same stubborn refusal to surrender was asserting itself again, demanding action rather than acceptance of inevitable decline. The Scarlet banners offered direction for energy that had been focused solely on preservation and maintenance. Commander Redpath approached me directly, his experienced gaze reading something in my expression that suggested receptiveness to his message. "Baker Keldrick," he said quietly, using my name with familiarity that implied deeper knowledge than casual observation could provide. "You have held this community together through your dedication to providing sustenance when resources were scarce. That same commitment to service would find worthy expression in our cause, protecting not just one village, but all of humanity's surviving children." The personal appeal struck precisely the psychological vulnerabilities that years of isolation and loss had created. The promise of meaningful connection, of belonging to something larger than daily survival, of contributing to victory rather than merely postponing defeat. The scarlet tabard that he offered seemed to glow with possibilities that transcended its physical reality. Within 2 hours, 7 villagers had committed to joining the recruitment party when it departed the following morning. The decision-making process varied among individuals, but common elements emerged from the discussions that continued throughout the afternoon. Desperation masked as hope. Exhaustion with defensive survival disguised as eagerness for offensive action. Loneliness transformed into anticipation of brotherhood. That evening, we gathered in the old temple for what might be our final communal meal as a complete community. The bread I had baked that morning seemed to carry additional significance, representing the culmination of 9 years spent perfecting skills that would soon be redirected toward completely different purposes. The familiar routine of breaking bread together had acquired the weight of ceremony, marking a transition point between one life and another. Those remaining in the village offered support that mixed genuine encouragement with barely concealed envy of our opportunity for escape. They would continue the careful work of preservation and maintenance, hoping that our sacrifice would somehow improve their prospects for long-term survival. The arrangement felt equitable despite its emotional complexity, different people choosing different responses to circumstances that offered no clearly superior alternatives. Commander Redpath and his companions established their camp in the village center, their disciplined routines providing glimpses of the organizational efficiency that would soon govern our own daily existence. Evening prayers conducted in unison, equipment maintenance performed with religious devotion, guard rotations that ensured constant security without disrupting rest for off-duty personnel. Everything spoke of institutions built to endure and expand, rather than merely survive. I lay awake most of that final night in my own bed, listening to familiar sounds that would soon be replaced by military environments I could not yet imagine. The building that had sheltered my family and housed my livelihood would stand empty until other refugees claimed it, or time completed the work of decay already begun. The ovens that had provided purpose for 9 years would grow cold, their fires extinguished when no one remained to maintain them. Dawn brought the final ritual of testing grain and lighting ovens, performed now as farewell rather than preparation for another day of routine service. The bread that emerged would feed those remaining in the village, my last contribution to the community that had sustained me through the years following my family's death. The familiar weight of warm loaves felt different somehow, carrying finality that transformed routine into memorial. The Scarlet banner unfurled as Commander Redpath's company prepared for departure, its vivid color blazing against the pale sky of early morning. 7 new recruits fell in behind the mounted Crusaders, our few possessions secured in packs that emphasized how little bound us to the life we were abandoning. The road ahead led toward purposes we could not fully comprehend, but had chosen to embrace nonetheless. Miller Gareth walked beside me as we left the village behind, his practical mind already working through implications of the commitment we had made. The grain stores he had maintained with obsessive care would be managed by others now, his expertise redirected towards supply chains that spanned battlefields rather than individual communities. The transition from civilian administrator to military quartermaster represented fundamental change, disguised as specialization. Behind us, Millhaven grew smaller with each step, until it disappeared entirely behind low hills that had marked the boundaries of my known world for nearly a decade. Ahead lay training facilities and combat assignments that would complete the transformation, begun by placing scarlet cloth over civilian clothing. The journey would take days to complete, providing time for final contemplation before old identity was surrendered entirely to new purpose. The rhythm of marching feet created meditation similar to the routine tasks that had structured my previous existence. Feed the machine, count 3 seconds. Feed the machine, count 3 seconds. Now it had become left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. The pattern was different, but the underlying principle of disciplined repetition remained constant. Soon there would be new rituals to learn and new skills to master in service of causes that transcended individual survival. The Scarlet Monastery of Tyr's Hand rose from the eastern plateau like a fortress built to withstand not just physical assault, but spiritual corruption itself. Red stone walls climbed toward watchtowers that flew banners visible for leagues in every direction, announcing the Crusade's presence to anyone who dared approach these sanctified lands. The architecture was deliberately imposing, designed to inspire awe in allies and fear in enemies while providing practical defensive advantages that could withstand extended siege. Our small group of recruits passed through gates reinforced with blessed steel and warded with protective symbols whose meanings I did not yet understand, but whose power seemed to hum in the air around us. Guards examined our documents with practiced efficiency, while their eyes assessed us for signs of corruption or deception that might indicate infiltration attempts. The inspection felt thorough without being hostile, professional evaluation rather than suspicious interrogation. Commander Redpath delivered us to a processing station where our civilian identities were systematically documented and then set aside for the duration of training. Personal possessions were catalogued and stored in numbered lockers that we would not access again until graduation or dismissal. The clothes we had worn during our journey were exchanged for simple brown robes that marked us as initiates undergoing purification before earning the right to wear scarlet. The dormitory assigned to new recruits contained 40 beds arranged in precise rows, with personal storage compartments underneath each bunk. The space was larger than what I had grown accustomed to during my years of solitary existence, but the presence of so many other people created a different kind of confinement. Privacy became impossible when every movement, every sound, every personal habit was exposed to constant observation by dormitory mates drawn from across the surviving territories of former Lordaeron. My assigned bed was number 27, located near the center of the middle row, with initiates on all sides whose backgrounds and motivations I would learn through proximity rather than choice. The man above me had been a town guard from the Hillsbrad foothills. The woman across the narrow aisle had worked as a scribe in one of the few remaining administrative centers. To my left was a former carpenter whose knowledge of construction would prove valuable for siege operations. To my right lay a young woman who had never known peace, born after the plague and raised in refugee camps where survival required constant vigilance. Brother Samuel, the dormitory supervisor, addressed our group with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed hundreds of initiates through identical orientation procedures. "Your previous lives are ended," he announced in tones that brooked no contradiction. "The person who entered these gates no longer exists. You are now raw material being, shaped into instruments of the light's will. Blank clay waiting to receive the sacred impress of righteous purpose." The first lesson began immediately with instruction in proper prayer posture and the recitation of fundamental doctrines that would be repeated until they became automatic responses rather than conscious thoughts. We learned to kneel with spines straight and hands clasped, heads bowed at precisely the correct angle to demonstrate humility without sacrificing alertness. The positions felt unnatural initially, but gradually became comfortable through repetition that made strange movements familiar. Blessed is the light, for it illuminates truth in a world shrouded by deception. Blessed is the crusade, for it serves the light without question or hesitation. Blessed is our service, for through righteous action comes spiritual purification. The words were simple enough to memorize quickly, but complex enough in their implications to provide material for extended contemplation during the hours between formal instruction periods. Daily schedule began before dawn, with communal prayers conducted in the chapel that occupied the monastery's spiritual center. 300 voices joined in perfect unison, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate through stone walls and into the very foundations of the ancient structure. The sound carried power that transcended individual faith, becoming something collective and overwhelming that lifted participants beyond their personal limitations. Physical conditioning followed prayer with exercises designed to build strength, endurance, and coordination necessary for combat effectiveness. Running circuits around the monastery's outer walls while carrying weighted packs. Climbing obstacles that simulated battlefield terrain. Combat drills with training weapons that built muscle memory for movements that would become automatic during actual fighting. The regimen was demanding but carefully structured to build capability gradually, rather than breaking bodies through excessive stress. Weapons instruction began with basic maintenance procedures that emphasized care and respect for tools that might determine survival in combat situations. We learned to clean and oil practice swords until they gleamed like mirrors, to check training armor for damage that might compromise protection, to maintain equipment standards that reflected pride in appearance as well as functional necessity. The lessons felt familiar, reminiscent of maintaining baking equipment where neglect could ruin entire batches of bread or damage expensive ovens. Brother Marcus, the weapons instructor, had served with distinction during campaigns against various enemies of humanity across multiple theaters of operation. His scarred hands and precise movements testified to extensive combat experience translated into teaching methods that emphasized practical effectiveness over theoretical knowledge. This blade will preserve your life if you maintain it properly and use it according to doctrine, he explained while demonstrating proper sword care. It will fail you if you treat it carelessly or ignore established procedures. The training weapons were real steel rather than wooden practice implements, heavy enough to build appropriate muscle groups, while safe enough to prevent serious injury during sparring sessions. Each initiate was assigned a specific sword that became their personal responsibility, numbered to ensure accountability, and marked with protective symbols that blessed the weapon for training purposes. I received sword number 43, its blade bearing small nicks that told stories of previous users who had learned these same lessons. Doctrinal instruction occupied the afternoon hours when physical exhaustion made intellectual focus challenging, but not impossible. Brother Sicilian, the chief instructor for ideological education, possessed the kind of charismatic authority that commanded attention through force of personality rather than institutional rank. His lessons transformed abstract theological concepts into practical guidelines for identifying and responding to various forms of corruption that threatened human survival. The enemy takes many forms, he explained during our third week of instruction, his voice carrying conviction earned through personal experience fighting the forces he described. Obvious threats like shambling corpses and demon-possessed cultists are easy to recognize and respond to appropriately, but corruption often wears familiar faces, speaking words that sound reasonable while advancing agenda that serves darkness rather than light. We learn to identify subtle signs of plague infection that might not manifest obvious symptoms for days or weeks after initial exposure. Behavioral changes that could indicate demonic influence or necromantic control. Speech patterns that suggested loyalty to enemies masquerading as friends. The instruction was detailed and practical, focused on survival skills rather than abstract theological speculation. Every lesson could mean the difference between detecting threats and falling victim to deception. The Forsaken represent perhaps the greatest danger to unwary humans, Brother Isilian continued, his tone shifting to something more urgent and personal. They retain intelligence and cunning while possessing the supernatural resilience of undeath. They can speak our language, understand our customs, and exploit our tendency toward compassion for apparent suffering. But beneath their familiar appearance lies corruption that seeks to spread itself to the living through plague and necromancy, disguised as liberation. Maps covered the classroom walls showing territories controlled by various enemy factions, marked with symbols that indicated different types of threats and appropriate responses. Red zones marked areas of heavy scourge presence where only experienced crusaders should venture. Yellow regions indicated contested, territories where careful reconnaissance was essential before committing forces. Green areas showed secure zones under Crusade protection where civilians could live without constant fear of corruption. Evening brought additional prayer sessions, followed by personal study time when initiates were expected to review doctrinal materials and practice weapon forms independently. The library contained approved texts that expanded on themes introduced during formal instruction, treatises on identifying corruption, tactical manuals for fighting various enemies, and inspirational accounts of Crusader victories in previous campaigns. Reading by candlelight felt familiar after years of studying recipe collections and supply ledgers in my bakery. The gradual transformation was more subtle than I had expected, accomplished through incremental changes that seemed reasonable when considered individually, but created fundamental alteration when combined over time. Daily prayers shifted our focus from personal concerns to collective mission. Physical training built capabilities that changed how we moved and how we perceived our bodies. Weapons instruction created comfort with tools of violence that had once seemed foreign and frightening. My dreams began to change during the fourth week, filled with images of righteous combat against enemies whose corruption was visible as physical deformity or unnatural behavior. I found myself winning these dream battles through application of techniques learned during training. wielding blessed weapons with skill that exceeded my actual capabilities. The victories felt satisfying in ways that successful bread baking had never achieved, offering purpose that transcended mere preservation or survival. Sleep became easier despite the constant presence of other people in the dormitory. The exhaustion produced by daily training ensured rest, while the security provided by monastery walls created peace unknown during my years of vigilant survival in plague-touched territories. For the first time since Elena and Sarah's death, I felt protected rather than merely persistent, part of something larger than individual endurance. Brotherhood developed naturally among initiates who shared the challenges and discoveries of training together. We learned to depend on each other for support during difficult exercises, to share knowledge that helped everyone improve performance, to maintain morale when homesickness or doubt threatened individual resolve. These relationships felt different from the necessity-based cooperation that had characterized village life, founded on common purpose rather than mutual need for survival. The hierarchy within the Crusade became clear through daily interactions with instructors and administrators whose ranks and responsibilities were marked by variations in their scarlet vestments. Brother initiates like ourselves wore simple brown robes that identified our status as trainees undergoing purification. Brothers who had completed basic training wore scarlet tunics with silver threading that marked them as full members of the organization. Captains and commanders displayed additional decorations that indicated their authority over specific units or specialized functions. High Inquisitor Whitemane visited our training cohort during the 6th week, her presence creating anticipation that built for days before her scheduled appearance. She moved through the ranks of kneeling initiates with regal authority that seemed to radiate power beyond mere institutional position. Her blessing felt personal despite being delivered to the entire group, as if she recognized something in each of us worthy of individual attention and encouragement. "Your faith grows stronger with each day of training," she observed, her voice carrying warmth that made her approval seem precious beyond description. "I see in your faces the dedication that will carry our sacred mission to victory against the forces of corruption. You are becoming the instruments through which the light will cleanse this world of taint and restore it to its proper state of purity and peace." The blessing ceremony marked our transition from initiates to probationary brothers, authorized to wear scarlet tunics while completing advanced training that would prepare us for assignment to active units. The new vestments felt heavier than their physical weight could account for, carrying significance that transformed how we moved and how others perceived us. We had become recognizable as crusaders rather than merely aspiring recruits. Advanced weapons training introduced us to blessed armaments that carried actual divine power rather than simple protective symbols. These weapons could channel holy energy that was particularly effective against undead enemies, causing damage that exceeded what purely physical force could achieve. The sensation of wielding such tools felt intoxicating, connection to power that transcended individual limitation and capability. Tactical instruction covered coordination between different types of Crusader units, from heavy infantry that could hold defensive positions against overwhelming odds to mobile cavalry that struck at enemy formations with devastating effectiveness. We learned to read battlefield signals that coordinated complex maneuvers, to respond quickly to changing conditions that required adaptive thinking rather than rigid adherence to predetermined plans. The complexity was fascinating, revealing layers of military science that civilian life had never required understanding. Combat psychology received particular emphasis as we prepared for actual operations against thinking enemies rather than training targets. Brother Isilian explained how corruption affected enemy decision-making, creating predictable weaknesses that experienced crusaders could exploit through proper application of learned tactics. The lessons were practical rather than theoretical, focused on surviving real, battles rather than winning academic debates about military doctrine. The enemy seeks to break your will through fear and deception, he taught during our final week of formal instruction. They will show you disturbing images designed to weaken resolve, speak words intended to create doubt about the righteousness of our cause, and offer false promises of mercy that serve only to lower your guard before striking. Remember that corruption lies even when it appears to speak truth, especially when it claims to offer easy alternatives to righteous struggle. Graduation approached with ceremonial preparation that emphasized the significance of transition from training to active service. We practiced marching formations that would be used during public ceremonies, rehearsed oaths that would formalize our commitment to the Crusade's mission, and received instruction in proper behavior when representing the organization in civilian territories. Everything was designed to ensure that we would reflect credit on the institution that had shaped us. The final examination combined all elements of training in scenarios that tested our ability to function as soldiers rather than students. We conducted simulated operations that included reconnaissance, assault, defense, and withdrawal phases, while maintaining proper doctrine and supporting fellow Crusaders through teamwork that had been developed over months of shared hardship. Success required applying everything learned while demonstrating readiness for actual combat assignments. My personal evaluation noted satisfactory progress in all required areas, with particular strength in logistics and resource management skills that translated well from civilian bakery operations to military supply functions. The assessment recommended assignment to quartermaster duties with frontline units, combining practical experience with newfound military capabilities in roles that would serve the Crusade's strategic objectives while utilizing my background effectively. The oath-taking ceremony was conducted in the monastery's Great Hall, with all training personnel in attendance to witness our formal induction into the ranks of active Crusaders. We knelt before blessed banners while speaking words that bound us irrevocably to the organization's mission, accepting obligations that transcended personal preference or comfort. The vows felt heavy with significance that would shape every decision for the remainder of our lives. I swear by the light that burns eternal to serve the Scarlet Crusade with unwavering dedication, to obey orders given by rightful authority without question or hesitation, to protect the innocent from corruption in all its forms, and to sacrifice whatever necessary to ensure humanity's survival in this dark age. May the light preserve my soul if I keep this oath, and may it abandon me to darkness if I prove false to sacred duty. The words had become familiar through rehearsal, but speaking them in formal ceremony created commitment that practice sessions could not replicate. Something fundamental had changed in the relationship between intention and obligation, transforming voluntary association into binding service that would endure until death or dismissal released us from our vows. That evening, wearing full scarlet vestments for the first time, I examined my reflection in the polished metal mirror that hung in the dormitory. The face looking back belonged to someone I recognized but did not entirely understand. Familiar features marked by months of training that had created confidence where uncertainty once existed. The baker who had measured flour and counted days seemed like someone from another lifetime, a person whose concerns belonged to a different universe. Orders arrived the following morning, sealed documents that would determine our immediate futures and assign us to the great work of cleansing Azeroth from corruption. Some graduates received postings to garrison units in secure territories where their primary duties would involve training new recruits and maintaining equipment. Others were assigned to active combat zones where they would immediately begin fighting the enemies they had trained to recognize and destroy. I opened my envelope with hands that remained steady, despite understanding that its contents would shape whether I lived or died in service to the light. The orders were precise and unambiguous. report to Captain Pernice of the 3rd Assault Company for immediate deployment to active operations in the Western Plague Lands. Transportation would depart within hours, providing no opportunity for extended farewells or second thoughts about the path that had brought me to this moment. The baker who had once stood before warm ovens in a village that no longer existed was gone, replaced by Crusader Keldric, whose life belonged entirely to the sacred mission of purifying Azeroth through righteous warfare. The transformation was complete, and the purpose for which it had been designed was about to be tested in circumstances where failure meant more than professional disappointment or personal setback. It meant death in service to something infinitely larger than individual survival or comfort. The Western Plaguelands stretched before our column, like a canvas painted in shades of decay and corruption, rolling hills covered with vegetation that grew in patterns too regular to be natural and colors too vivid to be healthy. Captain Pernice rode at the head of our formation, her scarlet banner snapping in wind that carried scents of chemical sweetness mixed with underlying rot. Behind her, 47 Crusaders advanced with the disciplined precision that months of training had burned into muscle memory. I marched in the supply section, my quartermaster duties keeping me closer to the baggage train than the forward scouts who probed ahead for signs of enemy activity. The blessed weapons and holy water that filled my inventory manifests felt heavier than their physical weight could account for, carrying significance that transformed routine logistics into sacred responsibility. Every blessed bolt and consecrated ration represented the light's power made manifest in material form. Our destination was the settlement of Corrin's Crossing, a strategic waypoint that had been overrun by Scourge forces during the initial plague outbreak and remained in enemy hands despite multiple attempts at reclamation. Intelligence reports suggested that the undead garrison had been weakened by recent conflicts with rival Forsaken factions, creating an opportunity for Crusader forces to establish a foothold in this contested region. The first contact occurred at midday, when our scouts reported movement among the ruined buildings that marked the settlement's outskirts. Shambling figures in various stages of decay moved with the purposeless wandering that characterized mindless undead, former humans whose bodies continued functioning long after their souls had departed for whatever fate awaited the plague's victims. The sight was familiar from my years in Millhaven, but now I viewed it through eyes trained to see tactical opportunities rather than merely threats to be avoided. Captain Pernice deployed our forces with practiced efficiency that spoke of extensive experience fighting these particular enemies. Heavy infantry formed the center of our battle line, their blessed weapons and consecrated armor providing protection against necromantic attacks that could drain life force as effectively as physical injury. Flanking elements moved to encircle the enemy position, while preventing retreat to defensive positions that might complicate assault operations. The attack began with prayers rather than weapons, 47 voices joining in harmonized invocation that called upon divine power to bless our efforts and curse our enemies. The familiar words felt different when spoken in sight of actual foes, carrying urgency that training exercises could not replicate. Blessed is the light, for it illuminates truth in darkness. Blessed is the crusade, for it serves righteousness without compromise. Blessed is our duty, for through sacred violence comes purification. Brother Marcus, now serving as my immediate superior in supply operations, distributed blessed ammunition with ceremonial precision that emphasized its sacred nature. These bolts have been consecrated by High Inquisitor Whitemane herself, he explained while passing out crossbow quarrels that gleamed with inner light. Each one carries divine power that will burn corruption from whatever it strikes, cleansing taint through righteous destruction. The charge began with trumpet calls that echoed across the plague-touched landscape, martial music that announced our presence to any enemies who might be observing from concealed positions. Our heavy infantry advanced in formation, while flanking elements moved to cut off potential escape routes, The coordination was beautiful in its deadly precision, military doctrine transformed into religious ceremony through the righteousness of our cause. The undead responded with the mindless aggression that characterized creatures driven by necromantic compulsion rather than tactical thinking. They shambled toward our lines without formation or strategy, seeking only to engage in melee combat where their supernatural resilience might overwhelm living opponents through sheer persistence. But they faced blessed weapons wielded by warriors whose faith could channel divine power directly into steel and iron. My first sight of blessed weapons in actual combat was revelation beyond anything training exercises had prepared me to witness. Brother Kellyan's sword blazed with holy light as it struck a shambling corpse, the divine energy burning away corruption so completely that the enemy simply ceased to exist rather than falling wounded to the ground. Other weapons produced similar effects, blessed bolts that reduced walking corpses to empty ash, and consecrated maces that shattered undead bones like brittle pottery. The battle lasted less than an hour, ending when the last shambling enemy was reduced to harmless remains that would never rise again to threaten the living. Our casualties were minimal, limited to minor injuries that divine magic healed immediately. The victory was complete and satisfying in ways that transcended simple tactical success, demonstrating the light's power to cleanse corruption through righteous warfare conducted according to sacred doctrine. Captain Pernice ordered thorough searches of the reclaimed settlement to ensure that no hidden enemies remained to threaten our occupation. The buildings showed signs of prolonged undead habitation, damage that went beyond normal combat to include deliberate desecration of religious symbols and family shrines. Personal possessions scattered throughout the ruins told stories of normal lives interrupted by catastrophic events that had transformed innocent civilians into shambling threats. We established defensive positions using procedures learned during training, setting up overlapping fields of fire that would prevent enemy counterattacks while providing secure bases for future operations. The work felt familiar after months of practicing identical techniques, but real terrain created complications that training areas had not included. Rubble piles blocked sight lines, damaged buildings provided concealment for infiltrators, and plague-tainted water sources required careful testing before consumption. That evening, as we gathered for communal prayer around fires built from furniture salvaged from ruined homes, the satisfaction of righteous victory filled every conversation. We had struck a blow against the forces of corruption, reclaimed territory that belonged to the living, and demonstrated the power of organized faith to overcome supernatural evil. The dead civilians buried in the settlement's cemetery could rest peacefully, knowing that their murderers had been destroyed by holy justice. But our mission in Corin's Crossing was only beginning. Intelligence gathered from captured enemy documents revealed that living humans were collaborating with undead forces, providing information and supplies that helped the Scourge maintain control over strategic territories. These traitors represented corruption in its most insidious form, appearing human while serving enemies who sought to destroy all human life. The first suspected collaborator was brought before Captain Pernice 3 days after our initial victory. A middle-aged man who claimed to be a refugee from the plague, but whose story contained inconsistencies that suggested deception. Brother Usilian conducted the interrogation with techniques learned through extensive experience, identifying hidden corruption, asking questions designed to reveal loyalties that might be concealed behind innocent appearances. The man's responses triggered warnings that our training had taught us to recognize. Excessive knowledge of enemy movements that refugees should not possess. Familiarity with undead behavior that suggested prolonged contact rather than brief encounters. Most damning, traces of alchemical substances that were commonly used in plague cultivation and distribution. The evidence was circumstantial but convincing when evaluated according to doctrines we had memorized during months of ideological instruction. Captain Pernice pronounced judgment with the solemn authority that came with years of similar decisions. This individual has been exposed to corrupting influences that make him a danger to innocent civilians, she declared. While his external appearance remains human, his loyalty to the forces of darkness makes him an enemy agent who must be eliminated before he can spread taint to others. The execution will be conducted according to standard procedures. I watched the proceedings from my position with the supply detachment, close enough to observe but not directly involved in the actual killing. Brother Kellyan's blessed sword ended the traitor's life with the same efficiency it had shown against undead enemies. Divine energy burning away corruption so quickly that death came without prolonged suffering. The body was cremated immediately to prevent necromantic resurrection, its ashes scattered in running water that would carry any remaining taint far from inhabited areas. The execution felt different from combat against obvious undead enemies, requiring mental adjustment that training had prepared but not made comfortable. This had been a living human being capable of speech and reasoning, someone whose corruption was invisible rather than manifestly obvious. Yet doctrine was clear that corruption took many forms, some more dangerous than others, precisely because they were harder to detect and resist. Over the following weeks, our operations expanded to include systematic investigation of suspected plague carriers and collaborator networks that intelligence reports suggested were operating throughout the region. Raiding settlements where enemy agents might be hiding, conducting interrogations designed to identify hidden loyalties, and eliminating threats before they could spread taint to innocent populations. Each mission was carefully planned and righteously executed according to established procedures. The town of Andorhel had been partially reclaimed by a group of refugees who claimed independence from both Scourge and Forsaken control. But intelligence gathering revealed suspicious activities that suggested possible collaboration with enemy forces. Unusual amounts of alchemical equipment that could be used for plague cultivation. Meeting schedules that coincided with known enemy movements. Most concerning, several residents who displayed behavioral patterns consistent with early-stage plague infection. Our assault on Andorhel was conducted at dawn, when defenders would be least prepared for coordinated attack. The settlement's walls were low and poorly maintained, designed to keep out wild animals rather than organized military forces. Our siege equipment, blessed by priests whose faith could enhance structural damage beyond purely physical capabilities, breached their defenses within minutes of beginning the assault. The fighting was different from our previous engagements against purely undead enemies. These defenders included living humans who fought with intelligence and coordination that made them more dangerous than mindless corpses. They used tactics learned from pre-plague military training, establishing killing zones and coordinating their fire to maximize casualties among attacking forces. Several of our brothers fell to weapons that carried no supernatural power, but were wielded by skilled hands guided by desperate courage. But our superior training and blessed equipment proved decisive in the urban combat that characterized fighting within the settlement itself. House-to-house searches revealed evidence of collaboration that justified our attack. Hidden caches of plague samples and necromantic texts. Correspondence with known enemy agents detailing information about Crusader movements and capabilities. Alchemical laboratories where infected materials were being processed for distribution to other settlements. The interrogation of captured defenders provided additional confirmation of the corruption that had infected this community. Under questioning conducted according to established doctrine, several admitted to maintaining contact with Forsaken agents in exchange for protection and supplies. Others revealed knowledge of plague distribution networks that could only have been gained through direct involvement in enemy operations. The evidence was overwhelming and demanded appropriate response. Captain Panisse ordered complete cleansing of the settlement to prevent further spread of corruption to innocent territories. The buildings were burned with consecrated fire that would destroy any lingering taint, their ashes blessed and scattered according to purification rituals that ensured permanent sanctification of the site. The surviving population was relocated to secure facilities where they could be properly examined and treated for possible infection. I found myself increasingly involved in these cleansing operations as my quartermaster duties expanded to include inventory management for captured materials and coordination of purification supplies. The work required careful attention to detail since improper handling of corrupted items could spread taint to Crusader personnel. Every piece of evidence had to be catalogued, examined by qualified specialists, and either destroyed or preserved according to its potential intelligence value. The blessed flames that consumed corrupted settlements created spectacular displays that were both beautiful and terrifying to observe. Consecrated fire burned with colors that normal combustion could not produce, creating pillars of light that were visible for leagues in every direction. The site served dual purposes, destroying corruption while announcing Crusader presence to anyone who might be watching from distant positions. Month by month, our operations grew in scope and complexity as intelligence networks revealed the full extent of enemy infiltration in territories that had appeared secure. Hidden collaborator cells operated in settlements throughout the Plague Lands, maintaining communication with Forsaken leadership while gathering information about Crusader activities and capabilities. Root them out required systematic investigation that left no potential threat unexamined. The psychological weight of these operations was managed through doctrinal instruction that reminded us constantly of the righteousness of our cause and the necessity of extreme measures when fighting an enemy that used deception as their primary weapon. The individuals we eliminated were not truly innocent, having chosen collaboration with forces of corruption over loyalty to humanity's survival. Their deaths served the greater good by preventing spread of taint that could doom entire communities to plague and undeath. Brotherhood among Crusader personnel deepened through shared participation in missions that required absolute trust and mutual dependence. We learned to rely on each other for support during difficult decisions, to share burdens that might otherwise prove psychologically overwhelming, and to maintain morale when the nature of our work created doubts or emotional stress. These relationships provided stability in circumstances that could easily destroy individuals who lacked proper support networks. Combat techniques evolved as we gained experience fighting thinking enemies who adapted their tactics based on observation of Crusader capabilities and procedures. Simple charges that worked against mindless undead proved inadequate against human defenders who could anticipate and counter predictable assault patterns. We learned urban warfare skills that emphasized speed and surprise over direct confrontation, using blessed weapons to maximum advantage in close-quarters combat. The blessed ammunition that I distributed began to include specialized rounds designed for specific enemy types. Explosive bolts that could breach fortified positions where corrupted humans might barricade themselves. Incendiary rounds that created consecrated fires capable of destroying plague samples and necromantic materials. Tracking projectiles that allowed pursuit of fleeing enemies across terrain where normal pursuit would be impossible. My personal weapon, the blessed sword that had been issued during final training exercises, became familiar through constant maintenance and occasional use during combat operations. The divine energy that flowed through its blade felt natural after months of practice, extension of faith made manifest in physical form. When circumstances required direct participation in combat rather than support duties, the weapon responded to trained movements with efficiency that exceeded purely physical capabilities. The gradual expansion of our mission parameters was presented as natural progression in the war against corruption, rather than fundamental change in operational doctrine. Enemy tactics evolved, requiring corresponding evolution in Crusader responses. Threats became more sophisticated, demanding more comprehensive countermeasures. The fight for humanity's survival justified whatever methods proved necessary for victory against forces that showed no mercy to innocent civilians. Summer brought increased enemy activity, as Forsaken forces attempted to reclaim territories that Crusader operations had cleared of corruption. Their attacks were well coordinated and supported by intelligence that suggested extensive preparation and planning. Defeating them required all the skills we had developed during months of combat operations, plus additional techniques that pushed the boundaries of what we had previously considered acceptable in righteous warfare. The Battle of Hearthglen marked the culmination of our first campaign season, a massive engagement where Crusader forces faced coordinated assault by multiple enemy factions, attempting to drive us from territories we had liberated through months of careful operations. The fighting lasted 3 days and resulted in victory that secured our position while demonstrating the effectiveness of doctrine that emphasized total commitment to purification rather than half measures that might allow corruption to survive and spread. Standing among the ruins of defeated enemy positions, surrounded by evidence of righteous victory achieved through application of everything we had learned during our transformation, from civilians to holy warriors, I felt satisfaction that transcended personal achievement. We had become instruments of divine will, tools through which the light worked to cleanse corruption from territories that belonged to the living. The baker who had once measured flour and worried about daily survival seemed like someone from another lifetime entirely, a person whose concerns had been trivial compared to the sacred mission that now defined all existence. The scarlet banner that flew over our conquered position blazed like fire against the evening sky, announcing to any observers that this territory was now under Crusader protection and would remain so as long as we possessed the faith and strength to defend it. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new opportunities to serve the light through righteous warfare against enemies who threatened humanity's survival. The work was never finished, but that was precisely what made it meaningful beyond any individual contribution or sacrifice. The summons to the Scarlet Monastery arrived during the autumn of my second year as a full Crusader, carried by a messenger whose scarlet robes bore the silver threading that marked direct service to High Inquisitor Whitemane herself. The parchment was sealed with blessed wax that felt warm to the touch, containing orders that would expand my understanding of the Crusade's true scope and sacred mission. Report immediately for advanced tactical instruction and spiritual purification in preparation for enhanced operational responsibilities. The monastery had grown since my initial training, its red stone walls rising higher and its fortifications extending further across the plateau that commanded the surrounding territory. New towers flew banners that I had not seen before, marking specialized divisions whose purposes were explained only to those deemed worthy of such knowledge. The architecture spoke of an organization that was expanding rather than merely surviving, building permanent institutions rather than temporary camps. Brother Superior Demetrius conducted my orientation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed hundreds of similar promotions over the years. Your service record indicates exceptional competence in supply operations and tactical support, he observed while reviewing documents that detailed every mission I had completed since graduation. Such capabilities are required for coordination between monastery operations and field units operating across multiple theaters of engagement. The advanced quarters assigned to personnel of my new rank contained amenities that seemed luxurious after years of field conditions and basic barracks accommodation. A private cell with stone walls thick enough to muffle sound, a writing desk for maintaining operational records, and a small shrine where personal prayers could supplement the communal worship that structured monastery routine. The space felt like recognition of enhanced status within the organization's hierarchy. Training for senior operational roles emphasized coordination between different types of Crusader forces rather than individual combat skills that had dominated my earlier instruction. I learned to manage supply chains that supported multiple companies operating simultaneously across vast territories. Communication procedures that maintained contact between monastery command and field units separated by hundreds of leagues. Intelligence analysis that transformed scattered reports into actionable information for strategic planning. The monastery's great library contained texts that had been denied to junior personnel, theological works that explained the deeper mysteries of corruption and purification that justified our expanding mission. I spent hours studying treatises on identifying hidden taint, recognizing enemy infiltration techniques, and implementing countermeasures that could protect innocent populations from threats they might not recognize until too late. Knowledge was power in warfare against enemies who used deception as their primary weapon. High Inquisitor Whitemane addressed our advanced training group during the third week of instruction, her presence creating anticipation that built for days before her scheduled appearance. She moved through the assembled senior personnel with authority that transcended institutional rank, carrying power that seemed to emanate from personal connection to divine source. Her words carried weight that transformed abstract concepts into personal revelation. The corruption we fight extends far beyond obvious undead shambling through ruined settlements, she explained, her voice reaching every corner of the Great Hall without apparent effort. Taint spreads through contact and contamination, creating networks of infection that can remain hidden for years while slowly poisoning everything they touch. Our mission requires vigilance that never rests, and determination that accepts no compromise with evil in any form. She described operations that had been conducted in territories I had never heard mentioned, campaigns against enemies whose nature surprised me with its variety and complexity, cultists who worshipped demons while maintaining appearances of normal human behavior, merchants who traded in cursed artifacts that spread corruption through seemingly innocent commercial transactions, even former allies who had been compromised by exposure to taint but refused to submit to purification procedures that could have saved their souls. The Argent Dawn represents perhaps our greatest disappointment, she continued, her tone carrying genuine sorrow mixed with righteous anger. These misguided individuals once served alongside us in the fight against obvious undead threats, but their willingness to negotiate with corrupted entities has made them unwitting agents of the very forces they claim to oppose. They extend mercy where justice is required, offering false hope where only cleansing fire can provide true salvation. Tactical briefings revealed the scope of Crusader operations across territories that stretched far beyond the Plague Lands where I had gained my initial combat experience. Supply convoys that carried blessed weapons and consecrated supplies to field units operating in regions where corruption had taken root among seemingly normal populations. Communication networks that maintained contact between monastery command and Crusader forces engaged in purification campaigns that might last for months without direct supervision. My first assignment to monastery operations involved coordinating supplies for a major offensive against forsaken positions in the ruins of Lordaeron city itself. The undead who controlled the former capital had declared independence from Lich King authority, claiming freedom while maintaining the supernatural corruption that made them abominations against natural order. Their intelligence and organization made them more dangerous than mindless shambling corpses, requiring careful planning and superior equipment to overcome. The logistics of supporting 500 Crusaders in extended urban combat demanded attention to details that field operations had never required. Specialized ammunition designed for fighting in confined spaces where ricochets could endanger friendly forces. Blessed oils that could consecrate large areas quickly during rapid advances through enemy territory. medical supplies enhanced with divine magic that could treat injuries inflicted by necromantic weapons whose effects lingered long after initial wounds healed. Brother Captain Renaud Maugraine commanded the assault force with authority that inspired confidence among veteran crusaders who had served under multiple leaders during years of continuous operations. His tactical briefings demonstrated mastery of urban warfare techniques that would be essential for success in the maze of tunnels and chambers that comprise the Undercity beneath Lord'Eron's ruins. The mission would require courage and faith in equal measure to overcome enemies who possessed every advantage except righteousness. The attack began before dawn, with prayers that called upon divine blessing for weapons and warriors about to engage in holy combat against forces of corruption. 300 voices joined in harmonized invocation that seemed to resonate through the monastery's stone walls and into the earth itself. The familiar words felt different when spoken in preparation for operations of this magnitude, carrying urgency that smaller engagements had never required. I accompanied the assault force as senior quartermaster responsible for maintaining supply lines during extended combat operations. The position kept me close enough to observe tactical developments while remaining focused on logistical requirements that could determine success or failure regardless of individual heroism or superior weaponry. Victory required more than courage and blessed arms. It demanded coordination and planning that transformed individual efforts into collective achievement. The Forsaken defenders fought with intelligence and desperate cunning that made them formidable opponents despite their corrupted nature. They had prepared defensive positions with careful attention to tactical advantages, creating overlapping fields of fire that channeled attacking forces into killing zones, where concentrated enemy fire could inflict maximum casualties. Their knowledge of the Undercity's layout allowed them to conduct fighting withdrawals that forced Crusader units to advance slowly through territory that favored defenders. But righteous purpose and superior training proved decisive in combat that lasted 18 hours without pause. Blessed weapons burned through undead resistance, while consecrated armor protected Crusader personnel from necromantic attacks that would have destroyed unprotected humans. Coordinated assaults broke defensive positions that had seemed impregnable, driving corrupted enemies from positions they had held since declaring independence from their former master. The victory was complete and satisfying beyond purely tactical considerations, demonstrating Crusader capability to conduct major operations against thinking enemies who possessed significant advantages in terrain and preparation. We had reclaimed territory that belonged to the living, destroyed corruption that threatened innocent populations throughout the region, and proven that organized faith could overcome any evil, regardless of its apparent strength or cunning. The intelligence gathered during urban combat operations revealed connections between Forsaken leadership and various enemy factions operating throughout territories that had appeared secure under Crusader protection. Communication networks that carried information about our capabilities and operational patterns to hostile forces planning counterattacks. Supply chains that provided corrupted materials to cultist cells attempting to spread taint among human populations. The scope of enemy coordination was larger and more sophisticated than previous intelligence had suggested. Captain Renaud's promotion to High Commander following the successful Lord'Eron operation reflected the Crusade's recognition of tactical excellence and inspirational leadership that had made victory possible despite overwhelming odds. His acceptance speech emphasized themes that resonated with every Crusader who had participated in the campaign: dedication to purification, willingness to sacrifice for righteous cause, and absolute commitment to protecting humanity from enemies who showed no mercy to innocent civilians. My own advancement to senior brother included responsibilities for coordinating intelligence analysis between field units and monastery command, translating scattered reports into comprehensive assessments, that could guide strategic planning for future operations. The work required skills that built upon my background in logistics, while demanding new capabilities for synthesizing information from sources whose reliability varied significantly. Success meant providing accurate intelligence that could save Crusader lives and improve mission effectiveness. The first major intelligence assessment that I prepared concerned enemy activities in territories controlled by Alliance forces, whose leadership had refused Crusader offers of cooperation against mutual threats. Despite shared opposition to undead corruption, these misguided humans maintained policies that protected known collaborators while limiting Crusader access to regions where purification operations were desperately needed. Their interference with righteous warfare made them obstacles to humanity's survival rather than allies in common cause. Reports from field units operating near Alliance territory described systematic obstruction of Crusader missions by forces that claimed to serve human interests while protecting individuals whose loyalty to corrupt entities had been clearly documented. Alliance patrols intercepted Crusader reconnaissance teams attempting to gather intelligence about enemy activities. Alliance administrators refused requests for cooperation in investigating suspected collaborator networks. Most frustrating, Alliance leadership actively sheltered individuals who had fled from regions where Crusader justice had exposed their treasonous activities. The analysis required careful documentation of specific incidents where Alliance interference had prevented successful completion of purification operations. Towns where known plague carriers had been granted sanctuary after fleeing Crusader jurisdiction. Administrative decisions that prevented extradition of suspected enemy agents to territories where proper investigation could determine their true loyalties. Military actions that protected supply convoys carrying materials whose ultimate destinations suggested support for hostile forces. High Inquisitor Whitemane reviewed the assessment with attention that suggested genuine concern about implications for future operations in contested territories. The conclusions were unavoidable despite their disturbing nature. Alliance policies were effectively providing aid and comfort to enemies of humanity, making them participants in corruption rather than opponents of it. Their misguided mercy towards suspected collaborators endangered innocent populations throughout regions where taint could spread unchecked while protected by Alliance jurisdiction. The decision to expand Crusader operations to include Alliance territories was presented as necessary evolution in response to changing enemy tactics rather than fundamental alteration of operational doctrine. Corruption had infiltrated Alliance command structure, influencing policies that served hostile interests while appearing to protect legitimate refugee populations. Purification of these territories would require careful operations that distinguished between innocent civilians who deserved protection and corrupted individuals who threatened humanity's survival. My first mission involving Alliance opposition occurred during autumn raids against suspected collaborator cells operating under Alliance protection in territories adjacent to Crusader-controlled regions. Intelligence had identified several individuals whose activities suggested direct contact with Forsaken agents, but Alliance administrators had refused extradition requests that would have permitted proper investigation under Crusader jurisdiction. Direct action was required to prevent further spread of corruption to innocent populations. The target settlement appeared prosperous and well defended, its walls maintained in good repair, and its defenders equipped with standard Alliance military gear. Citizens moved freely through streets that showed no obvious signs of corruption or taint, creating an appearance of normalcy that concealed whatever conspiracy had attracted Crusader attention. Identifying actual threats among innocent civilians would require careful observation and precise intelligence rather than general assault tactics. Brother Captain Thessarian conducted operational briefings with emphasis on discrimination between legitimate targets and innocent bystanders who deserved protection rather than punishment. Our mission was purification rather than destruction, elimination of specific threats rather than general devastation. Success would be measured by surgical precision that removed corruption while preserving everything worth defending in human civilization. The assault began before dawn, with simultaneous strikes against predetermined targets, whose activities had been documented through months of surveillance and intelligence gathering. Coordinated teams moved against suspected collaborators, while other units secured escape routes and prevented interference by Alliance forces who might attempt to protect known threats. The operation required speed and precision that left no opportunity for enemies to escape justice or warn Confederates about Crusader capabilities. Resistance was limited and quickly overcome by Crusader forces whose training and blessed equipment provided decisive advantages over Alliance defenders equipped with mundane weapons that carried no divine enhancement. The defenders fought bravely but futilely against warriors whose faith provided protection beyond purely physical armor. Their courage was admirable, even though their cause was corrupted by association with forces that threatened humanity's survival. The intelligence gathered during building searches confirmed suspicions about collaborator activities while revealing additional connections to enemy networks that extended far beyond this single settlement. Hidden caches of correspondence with known Forsaken agents. Alchemical equipment used for processing plague samples into forms suitable for covert distribution. Maps marking Crusader positions and operational patterns that could only have been created through systematic espionage over extended periods. The interrogations conducted according to established doctrine produced confessions that detailed the scope of Alliance involvement in activities that aided enemies of humanity, while appearing to serve legitimate administrative functions. Transportation networks that carried enemy agents disguised as legitimate refugees. Financial systems that funded hostile operations through seemingly innocent commercial transactions. Information sharing that provided enemy forces with intelligence about Crusader capabilities and operational planning. Several Alliance officers were among those whose corruption was exposed through proper investigation techniques. Their participation in treasonous activities documented through evidence that could not be disputed or explained through innocent interpretation. These individuals had betrayed oaths of service to humanity while maintaining positions of trust and authority that allowed them to influence policy in ways that served hostile interests. Their treason demanded appropriate punishment according to military justice standards that recognized no distinction between enemies based on their apparent legitimacy. The executions were conducted with ceremony appropriate to the gravity of their crimes, while demonstrating mercy that offered spiritual salvation to those who repented their collaboration with forces of corruption. Blessed weapons ensured quick deaths that prevented prolonged suffering, while consecrated fire purified remains that might otherwise have been corrupted through necromantic resurrection. Their souls were commended to whatever divine judgment awaited individuals whose choices had led them to betray their own species. News of the operation's success spread through Alliance territories with speed that suggested coordination between enemy intelligence networks and administrative officials who served hostile interests while maintaining appearances of legitimate authority. Alliance leadership denounced Crusader actions with rhetoric that revealed their priorities. Protecting suspected collaborators took precedence over investigating threats to innocent civilians whose lives might be endangered by unchecked corruption. The Alliance response included military actions that placed their forces in direct conflict with Crusader units, attempting to complete purification operations in territories where corruption had taken root among seemingly normal populations. These engagements were conducted with reluctance on both sides, recognition that circumstances had forced conflict between groups that should have been allies against common enemies threatening humanity's survival. But doctrine was clear about appropriate responses, when legitimate authority became corrupted through infiltration or misguided policies that served hostile interests rather than human welfare. Alliance leadership had chosen to protect enemies of humanity while obstructing operations designed to prevent spread of corruption among innocent populations. Their interference with righteous warfare made them obstacles to salvation rather than participants in common cause against mutual threats. Combat against Alliance forces required different tactics than those developed for fighting undead enemies or corrupted collaborators. These were trained soldiers equipped with quality weapons and armor, fighting for causes they believed served legitimate purposes, even though their leadership had been compromised by enemy influence. Their skill and dedication made them dangerous opponents, despite fighting for wrong reasons based on corrupted information. The psychological burden of fighting former allies was addressed through expanded doctrinal instruction that emphasized the necessity of opposing corruption, regardless of its apparent source or legitimacy. Evil could wear familiar faces and speak reasonable words while advancing agenda that served darkness rather than light. Protecting innocent populations required vigilance that never rested and determination that accepted no compromise with forces that threatened humanity's survival, regardless of their political affiliations or institutional authority. Month by month, the scope of Crusader operations expanded to address threats that had been identified through systematic intelligence analysis and field observations by units operating across multiple theaters of engagement. Supply networks that supported hostile operations while maintaining appearances of legitimate commerce. Administrative systems that protected enemy agents through bureaucratic procedures designed to obstruct investigation rather than ensure justice. Military units whose leadership had been compromised by corruption that influenced tactical decisions in ways that served hostile interests. The constant expansion of mission parameters was justified through theological analysis that revealed the true nature of corruption as force that sought to infiltrate and control every aspect of human civilization, rather than simply destroying it through direct assault. Victory required comprehensive purification that eliminated all sources of taint, regardless of how carefully they might be concealed behind facades of legitimacy and social acceptance. My promotion to Brother Commander included authority over intelligence operations throughout the Northern Territories, coordinating assessment and analysis that guided strategic planning for operations designed to root out corruption before it could spread to regions that remained pure. The responsibility was enormous, and the consequences of failure would affect innocent populations who depended on Crusader protection, whether they realized it or not. Standing in the monastery's highest tower at the end of my 5th year of active service, watching scarlet banners fly over territories that had been cleansed through righteous warfare conducted according to sacred doctrine, I felt satisfaction that transcended personal achievement. The Crusade had grown from desperate resistance movement to comprehensive institution capable of protecting humanity from enemies who used every possible method to spread corruption among innocent populations. The baker who had once worried about daily survival in a plague-touched village seemed like someone from another lifetime entirely, a person whose concerns had been trivial compared to the sacred mission that now defined all existence. Tomorrow would bring new threats to investigate and new operations to conduct in service of humanity's survival against enemies who showed no mercy to those they sought to corrupt or destroy. The first crack in my faith appeared during the winter of my 6th year as a Brother Commander, manifesting not as dramatic revelation, but as small inconsistency that refused to resolve despite careful consideration. Intelligence reports had been arriving with unusual frequency from field units operating in territories where corruption was supposedly being cleansed according to established doctrine. But the patterns described in these communications did not match expected outcomes from successful purification operations. I had been reviewing casualty reports from the 3rd Assault Company when something in the numbers triggered recognition that I could not initially identify. The ratio of civilian deaths to confirmed enemy eliminations was higher than historical averages suggested it should be, even accounting for increased enemy infiltration and improved deception techniques. More troubling, the geographical distribution of these casualties clustered around settlements that intelligence had previously marked as low-priority targets with minimal corruption indicators. Brother Superior Fairbanks, my immediate supervisor for intelligence analysis, dismissed my concerns with explanations that seemed reasonable when considered individually, but created troubling patterns when viewed collectively. Enemy tactics were evolving, requiring more aggressive responses to prevent taint from spreading to innocent populations. Corruption was becoming subtler and harder to detect, necessitating broader investigation parameters that might occasionally affect bystanders. The mission of protecting humanity sometimes demanded difficult decisions that prioritized long-term survival over short-term mercy. These justifications felt familiar because I had offered similar explanations during my own operational briefings when field commanders questioned orders that seemed to exceed the scope of specific threats identified through intelligence analysis. The logic was internally consistent and supported by doctrinal teachings that emphasized comprehensive purification rather than surgical strikes that might leave hidden corruption intact. But something in the repetition of these patterns suggested explanations that served purposes beyond rational analysis. The monastery's archives contained operational records stretching back to the Crusade's founding, detailed documentation that should have provided historical context for evaluating current activities against established precedents. Brother Commander Arugal granted me access to these materials as part of my enhanced responsibilities for strategic assessment, but warned that some documents required special interpretation due to their sensitive nature and potential for misunderstanding by personnel lacking proper theological training. The earliest records described operations that matched my understanding of righteous warfare against obvious enemies of humanity, coordinated assaults against undead strongholds, systematic elimination of confirmed plague carriers, tactical cooperation with other human factions fighting common threats. The mission statements were clear, and the target selection criteria were specific enough to prevent confusion about appropriate objectives for Crusader intervention. But the documentation showed gradual evolution in operational parameters that expanded the definition of corruption to include categories I had not encountered during my training or field experience. Political dissent that allegedly weakened human unity against external threats. Economic activities that supposedly provided indirect support to enemy operations. Religious practices that differed from orthodox interpretations of light-based theology. Social behaviors that were claimed to indicate psychological vulnerability to corrupting influences. Each expansion had been justified through theological analysis that connected seemingly innocent activities to larger patterns of enemy infiltration and influence. The logic was sophisticated and internally consistent, building upon previous conclusions to reach new determinations about threats that required Crusader intervention. But the cumulative effect was mission parameters that bore little resemblance to the defensive warfare against obvious corruption that had originally motivated my decision to join the organization. The promotion ceremony for newly graduated initiates provided opportunity to observe Grand Crusader Dathrohan in person, his presence commanding attention through authority that seemed to transcend institutional rank. His scarlet vestments blazed with silver threading that caught torchlight with each movement, creating patterns that suggested wealth and power beyond what military service typically provided. When he spoke, his voice carried conviction that made abstract theological concepts feel personal and urgent. but something in his bearing triggered recognition that I could not clearly identify. Familiarity that suggested previous encounter despite my certainty that we had never met before this ceremony. His mannerisms were practiced and authoritative, movements economical and purposeful in ways that spoke of extensive experience commanding large organizations. Yet occasionally, his expressions shifted to something that seemed inconsistent with his public persona. Brief moments when his face showed calculation that felt alien to the righteous dedication that supposedly motivated all Crusader leadership. His speech to the new graduates emphasized themes that had become central to advanced doctrinal instruction. Warnings about corruption that could wear familiar faces while pursuing agenda that served darkness rather than light. The enemy sought to infiltrate human institutions through individuals whose apparent legitimacy concealed true loyalties to forces opposed to humanity's survival. Vigilance required constant suspicion of anyone whose activities could not be perfectly accounted for through comprehensive investigation. The content was familiar and appropriate for graduates preparing to assume active duties in territories where enemy infiltration posed constant threats. But delivery felt different somehow, carrying undertones that suggested personal knowledge of deception techniques rather than theoretical understanding derived from study and training. Grand Crusader. Dathrohan spoke like someone who understood corruption from intimate experience rather than righteous opposition to it. These observations would have been dismissed as irrelevant speculation under normal circumstances, products of imagination rather than evidence requiring investigation. But they occurred during the same period when other inconsistencies were accumulating in ways that demanded attention from anyone responsible for maintaining accurate assessment of organizational capabilities and mission effectiveness. Pattern recognition was fundamental to intelligence analysis, and patterns were emerging that could not be explained through coincidence or misunderstanding. The assignment to coordinate supplies for a major operation against forsaken positions in Tirisful Glades provided access to operational planning documents that revealed decision-making processes I had not previously observed. High Commander Renault Maugraine would lead the assault with tactical support from veteran officers whose experience included multiple successful engagements against intelligent undead enemies. The mission objectives were clearly defined, and the resource allocation was appropriate for operations of this magnitude. But supplementary orders contained provisions that seemed disconnected from stated military objectives. Instructions for handling specific individuals whose presence in the target area had been confirmed through reconnaissance, but whose threat level did not justify the attention they were receiving. Alexandros Maugraine, former paladin and wielder of the legendary weapon Ashbringer, was reported to be operating independently in regions where the assault would occur. Special procedures were outlined for containing his activities should contact occur during normal operations. The documentation described Alexandros Maugraine as potentially dangerous due to his independent status and possible exposure to corrupting influences during extended operations in plague-touched territories. His refusal to submit to proper debriefing and purification procedures following previous missions suggested psychological changes that might indicate compromise by enemy forces. Most concerning, his possession of weapons whose provenance could not be verified through Crusader authorities represented security risks that demanded careful management. These characterizations seemed inconsistent with historical records that portrayed Alexandros Maugraine as exemplary paladin whose dedication to fighting corruption had never been questioned by legitimate authorities. His service record included numerous commendations for heroism and tactical excellence in operations against undead enemies. The weapon he carried had been consecrated through procedures that should have provided protection against any corrupting influences that might seek to compromise its wielder. High Commander Renault's personal briefing provided additional context that explained the apparent contradictions in official documentation. His father's extended isolation had created vulnerabilities that enemy forces might exploit through psychological manipulation or supernatural influence. Alexandros Mograin's refusal to coordinate with organized Crusader forces endangered operational security by creating unpredictable variables in territories where careful planning was essential for mission success. Most seriously, his independent activities might interfere with purification operations that required comprehensive control over all variables affecting target areas. The explanation was reasonable and supported by tactical considerations that justified special attention to individuals whose activities could affect mission outcomes regardless of their apparent loyalties or previous service records. But something in Renault's presentation suggested motivations that extended beyond purely operational concerns. His tone carried personal intensity when discussing his father's activities, emotion that seemed inappropriate for professional military briefings where objective analysis should predominate over individual feelings. The assault on Tirisful Glades proceeded according to plan, with minimal resistance from Forsaken forces who had apparently withdrawn from defensive positions rather than engaging superior Crusader forces in direct combat. The tactical situation developed exactly as intelligence assessments had predicted, allowing rapid advance through territories that had been marked for comprehensive purification. Victory appeared certain until unexpected contact with Alexandros Mograin complicated operations in ways that contingency planning had not anticipated. The confrontation occurred in the ruins of a chapel where the former paladin had been conducting activities that High Commander Renault characterized as dangerous research into corrupted artifacts. Alexandros Mograin carried himself with authority earned through decades of successful combat against forces of corruption, his bearing suggesting confidence in righteous cause that transcended institutional authority or organizational hierarchy. When he spoke, his voice carried conviction that seemed genuine rather than calculated. The accusations that followed revealed information that challenged fundamental assumptions about Crusader leadership and mission objectives. Alexandros Mograin claimed that High Commander Renault was operating under orders that served enemy interests rather than human welfare, participating in conspiracy that used Crusader resources to advance agenda opposed to everything the organization supposedly represented. Most shocking, he alleged that Grand Crusader Dathrohan himself had been compromised by demonic influence that controlled policy decisions while maintaining appearances of legitimate authority. These charges seemed impossible to accept, given the source's isolation and potential exposure to corrupting influences that might have distorted his perception of events beyond his direct observation. But his detailed knowledge of recent operational decisions suggested access to information that should have been available only to senior leadership with appropriate security clearances. His descriptions of tactical modifications and resource allocation patterns matched classified intelligence that external sources should not have possessed. High Commander Renault's response combined righteous anger with tactical precision as he challenged his father's allegations through point-by-point refutation, supported by documentation and witness testimony. The evidence was comprehensive and convincing, demonstrating systematic refutation of claims that had been based on speculation rather than direct observation. But the confrontation carried emotional undercurrents that suggested personal rather than purely professional motivations driving the conflict. The betrayal came without warning, as High Commander Renault drew his weapon against the man who had trained him in combat techniques and inspired his dedication to fighting corruption. The attack was swift and decisive, blessed steel penetrating armor that should have provided protection against any mundane weapon. Alexandros Mograin fell without opportunity to defend himself, killed by someone he had trusted absolutely to honor bonds that transcended organizational loyalty or institutional authority. The weapon that had delivered the fatal blow was the legendary Ashbringer itself, turned against its original wielder through treachery that transformed blessed artifact into instrument of murder. The sword's sacred power was corrupted by the evil of patricide, divine energy twisted into something dark and wrong that burned with unnatural light. High Commander Renault claimed the weapon with ceremony appropriate to rightful inheritance, but its corruption was visible to anyone with eyes to see. The official report described justified elimination of rogue operative whose activities threatened mission security and operational effectiveness. Alexandros Mograin's refusal to submit to proper authority had made violent resolution inevitable when negotiation proved ineffective for ensuring compliance with established procedures. The recovery of potentially dangerous artifacts was presented as successful completion of secondary objectives that enhanced overall mission effectiveness. But witnesses to the actual confrontation carried knowledge that contradicted official accounts in ways that could not be explained through misunderstanding or incomplete information. The killing had been premeditated rather than spontaneous, prepared through advanced planning that suggested conspiracy rather than tactical necessity. Most disturbing, High Commander Renault's behavior following the murder showed satisfaction that exceeded what professional duty could justify. Emotion that spoke of personal gratification derived from causing suffering. The return journey to monastery headquarters provided time for processing observations that challenged everything I had believed about Crusader leadership and organizational mission. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, suggesting corruption at the highest levels of command structure that controlled policy decisions affecting thousands of personnel and millions of civilians in territories under Crusader protection. If these suspicions were accurate, then my service had been directed toward objectives that served enemy interests rather than human welfare. The implications extended far beyond individual cases of corruption or misguided policy decisions. Every operation I had supported, every mission I had planned, every intelligence assessment I had prepared had contributed to an agenda that advanced darkness while claiming to serve light. The villages we had cleansed might have been innocent communities destroyed to satisfy demonic requirements for human suffering. The collaborators we had eliminated might have been loyal citizens whose only crime was opposing corrupted authority that masqueraded as legitimate government. Brother Superior Fairbanks conducted my debriefing with standard procedures designed to extract operational intelligence while identifying potential security concerns that might affect future missions. His questions were thorough and professional, focusing on tactical developments and resource utilization rather than subjective impressions that might reflect personal bias or emotional stress. But his attention seemed particularly focused on my observations regarding High Commander Renault's conduct during critical phases of the operation. The interview revealed that other personnel had reported similar concerns about recent changes in leadership behavior and operational priorities that seemed inconsistent with established doctrine and historical precedent. These reports were being evaluated through appropriate channels to determine whether corrective action might be necessary to maintain organizational effectiveness. However, premature disclosure of ongoing investigations could compromise security and endanger innocent personnel who might be affected by whatever measures proved necessary. The warning was delivered with professional courtesy that concealed underlying threat, making clear that discretion was essential for personal survival as well as institutional security. Speaking about classified matters to unauthorized personnel would be treated as breach of security protocols that endangered crucial operations in multiple theaters of engagement. The consequences for such violations would be severe and permanent, affecting not only individual careers, but family members and associates who might be considered security risks by extension. These implications created psychological pressure that competed with moral obligations that seemed to demand action regardless of personal consequences. Knowledge of corruption at senior levels carried responsibility for attempting correction through whatever means might be available to someone in my position. But effective action required careful planning and extensive preparation that might not be possible while maintaining operational security necessary for survival in an environment where suspicion could prove fatal. The promotion ceremony that elevated High Commander Renault to Grand Commander status following his father's death was conducted with pomp appropriate to honoring fallen heroes while celebrating worthy successors. Grand Crusader Dathrohan presided over proceedings that emphasized continuity and stability during transitions that might otherwise create vulnerability to enemy exploitation. The new commander's dedication to Crusader principles was praised as inheritance of noble tradition that would guide future operations according to established doctrine. But observing the ceremony with knowledge of actual circumstances surrounding Alexandros Mograin's death transformed celebration into macabre theater, where murderers honored their victims while accepting recognition for crimes presented as heroic service. The blessed weapons and consecrated banners that decorated the Great Hall became props in performance designed to conceal truth behind facades of righteousness and divine approval. Every prayer and every pledge of loyalty served purposes that contradicted their apparent meaning. The corruption extended beyond individual cases to encompass institutional structures that had been designed to serve evil while maintaining appearances of legitimate authority. Training programs that created fanatics rather than protectors. Intelligence systems that identified innocent targets for elimination. Supply networks that supported operations whose actual objectives served demonic agenda rather than human welfare. The entire organization had become instrument of darkness, disguised as beacon of light. My own complicity in these crimes was undeniable, despite ignorance of their true nature during years of dedicated service. Every intelligence assessment had provided information used for targeting innocents. Every supply requisition had supported operations that advanced enemy interests. Every promotion had increased my ability to contribute to agenda that served corruption while claiming to oppose it. The transformation from defender to destroyer had been so gradual that recognition came only after it was too late for redemption. The psychological mechanisms that had enabled this transformation were the same techniques that had converted me from civilian baker to military crusader during initial training and indoctrination. Gradual modification of beliefs through repetitive exposure to ideological content. Social pressure that made conformity necessary for survival and advancement. Institutional rewards that reinforced behaviors serving organizational objectives regardless of their actual moral content. These methods had proven equally effective for creating servants of darkness from individuals who genuinely believed they were fighting for light. The realization created existential crises that threatened fundamental assumptions about identity and purpose that had provided meaning for years of service and sacrifice. The person I had become was antithesis of everything the person I had been would have opposed with every available resource. Yet the transformation had felt natural and righteous at every stage, supported by rational justifications and moral imperatives that had seemed compelling when evaluated according to information available at the time. Escape from this situation was impossible through conventional means, since the corruption extended throughout organizational hierarchy and institutional structure. Speaking truth would result in elimination as security threat while accomplishing nothing positive for innocent populations suffering under Crusader oppression. Desertion would provide personal safety while abandoning responsibility for minimizing damage that continued operations would inflict on defenseless civilians. Continued service meant active participation in evil, while hoping for opportunities to limit harm through sabotage or misdirection. The choice between various forms of moral compromise reflected the psychological prison that corruption had created around anyone whose position provided knowledge of its true scope and nature. Every option required accepting responsibility for consequences that would cause suffering, regardless of individual intentions or moral preferences. The institutional machinery of evil continued operating whether or not particular individuals chose to participate in its functions. Standing before the mirror in my private quarters during the final weeks of autumn, wearing scarlet vestments that had once represented everything noble about human resistance to corruption, I studied features that belonged to someone I no longer recognized as myself. The face looking back carried confidence and authority, earned through years of successful service to causes that had proven to be fundamentally evil. The baker who had measured flour and worried about daily bread seemed like someone from another universe entirely, a person whose innocence had been systematically destroyed through techniques designed to create willing servants of darkness. Tomorrow would bring new missions and new opportunities to serve masters whose identity had been concealed behind facades of righteousness and divine authority. The work would continue regardless of individual knowledge or preference, consuming human lives and souls according to patterns established long before my involvement and destined to persist long after my eventual elimination or replacement. The machinery of corruption was vast and eternal, requiring only willing hands to operate mechanisms that transformed hope into despair and light into darkness. The scarlet banner that flew from my window blazed like fire against the winter sky, announcing Crusader presence to anyone observing from surrounding territories. But now I understood what that presence truly meant for populations unfortunate enough to attract organizational attention. We were harbingers of destruction disguised as agents of salvation, bringing death in service to powers that fed on human suffering, while claiming divine mandate for actions that served purely evil purposes. The understanding that came with Winter's End was not revelation, but recognition, the simple acknowledgement of what I had always been becoming, since that first morning when scarlet banners appeared on the horizon. Standing in the monastery's highest tower, as spring returned to plague-touched lands, watching new recruits march through gates that had welcomed me 7 years earlier, I finally comprehended the true nature of the machinery I had joined. The Scarlet Crusade was not an organization that could be corrupted, because corruption had been its purpose from the beginning. We were not defenders who had lost our way, but instruments deliberately crafted to serve darkness while believing we served light. The transformation that had changed me from baker to quartermaster, to intelligence analyst, to willing participant in evil, had been engineered by powers that understood human psychology better than humans understood themselves. But this knowledge brought peace rather than despair, because it revealed the pointlessness of individual resistance to forces vast beyond personal comprehension. The crusade would continue, whether I participated willingly or was eliminated as security threat. New recruits would replace fallen veterans according to patterns established long before my birth, and destined to persist long after my death. The machinery required willing hands to operate its mechanisms, but any hands would suffice when properly trained and motivated. I was no longer the baker who had measured flour and counted peaceful days, nor the crusader who had believed in righteous warfare against obvious evil. I had become something else entirely, a function within a system that converted human hope into supernatural suffering. The role was permanent, and the service was eternal, binding me to purposes that transcended individual preference or moral judgment. In accepting what I had become, I found the only peace available to someone who had traveled so far from innocence that return was impossible. Tomorrow would bring new missions in service to masters whose identity remained concealed behind facades of divine authority. The work would continue as it always had, consuming souls while claiming to save them. The Scarlet banner would fly until the end of time itself, and I would serve beneath it willingly, because willing service was easier than futile resistance to inevitable fate.